Okay, so homeostasis is defined as maintaining a constant internal environment. So what that means is in our bodies, we always want everything to remain the same. So for example, the pH of our blood must always remain at 7, or osmotic potential, meaning inside your cells you always need a certain amount of glucose or ions or minerals or things to maintain that osmosis, because we don't want to lose too much water or gain too much water in different areas, like for our blood, an example, or our temperature. We always maintain a constant body temperature, as well as oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations, because without maintaining those gradients, it means that things won't move where they need to, and then we won't get the proper nutrients or gases or anything that we need for things like respiration to get our energy, and things won't function correctly. So for homeostasis, all the mechanisms to maintain all the different areas are usually done by what we call a negative feedback mechanism. So a negative feedback means that when one thing rises, it triggers the response to counteract that. Okay, so for example, when your body temperature rises, okay, it triggers a series of responses to lower the body temperature, and as soon as that gets lowered, it then triggers the mechanism to stop. Okay, so they always work counteracting each other, because when one thing gets too high, we are going to have a mechanism that's going to lower it, and then as soon as it gets low, it's going to stop that mechanism. And that's always usually controlled by the brain. So there are different parts of the brain that control different things. Okay, so some of the glands that I explained to you yesterday during hormones, for example, in the hypothalamus, that controls negative feedback mechanisms, and it stimulates different triggers when things in our body get too high or too low. So the main mechanism that we need to look at is how we maintain our temperature in our body. So temperature, we normally in the human body want to maintain our temperature by between about 35.8 and 37.7 degrees. Okay, so we maintain it constant because that's the important temperature where most of our enzymes work at their optimum. Okay, so we maintain this body temperature so that all our enzymes can work optimally, so that they can work efficiently and we can get everything that we need in our cells. So any temperatures below 34 degrees and above 40 degrees are very, very dangerous. So anything below 34 degrees, our enzymes become way too inactive and all the body processes slow down. And anything above 40 degrees, our enzymes denature and everything stops working. So the main organ that controls our temperature is the skin. So the skin is super important in regulating our body temperature, but it also has other functions such as protection and sensitivity. So now when I talk about protection, that means that you have lots of layers to your skin so that you don't lose too much water, as well as bacteria and harmful microorganisms can't get in. And your skin also protects you from UV rays, which are very dangerous because they can mutate things in your DNA. As well as then sensitivity would be our skin has all of the sense receptors that we need to be able to survey our surroundings, because our skin has touch receptors, pressure receptors, heat receptors, cold receptors, and pain receptors. And that way it allows our nervous system to have the correct reaction when we touch something hot or there's too much pressure or things like that, and our body can respond in the correct ways. So that's why the skin is one of the most important organs in your body. So if we look at the specific anatomy of the skin, if I look at a cross section through the skin, it will look something like this, okay? There is multiple layers to it, and in different layers, you have different things. So starting at the very top, okay, so this is the outside, and then these are the layers into the skin going deeper down towards the inside. So the top layer there, at the very outside of the skin, that we call the epidermis. Directly below the epidermis, there is a much bigger layer, and that layer we call the dermis. And then directly below the dermis, we have a layer that contains large amounts of fatty tissue, and that we call the subcutaneous tissue layer. So those are our three main layers to the skin. And then within those layers, starting at the top in the epidermis layer, on the outside, you have hairs. Okay, and you also have this layer of cells that we call melanocytes. So now melanocytes are cells in this epidermis that can produce a substance called melanin. Now melanin is a dark-colored pigment that helps absorb those UV rays. So the more UV rays you absorb, the more melanin you will produce, and the darker the skin will become. So the more melanin there is, the more dark pigment there is. Okay, and then you will also have these little pores in there, which would be part of your sweat glands. So those are in the epidermis. Then in the dermis is all of the layers underneath. So we have the hairs coming out through the top, but those extend down into the dermis, and they sit in what we call a hair follicle. And then surrounding that hair follicle, there is a gland, and that gland is called the sebaceous gland. Now, the sebaceous gland is there to release oils, okay, and fatty liquids into the hair follicle so that it gets lubricated and softens around the skin, okay? And then holding that hair follicle with that hair, there is a little muscle, and we call that the hair erector muscle, because that allows your hairs to stand up or lie down, because that has an important impact on cooling or warming the skin. Okay, then we also have a sweat gland, which releases sweat through the pores. Okay, and surrounding the entire layer, all the way through into all the different parts, we have blood vessels. So now our blood vessels would then be carrying your oxygenated and deoxygenated blood away from all of these different parts. Okay, and then you also have nerves running all the way through, and the nerves in different areas have your different functions. So remember, I just said there is touch receptors, pressure receptors, heat receptors, cold receptors. Those are all the nerves, and they would lie all the way through in different parts, and different areas of those nerves would then sense different things. So that, for example, would be a pressure nerve to detect pressure deep down. Okay, so those would be all the different parts to the anatomy of the skin, and then each part plays a specific role in helping either in protection or sensitivity or maintaining temperature. So maintaining temperature we call thermoregulation. So now thermoregulation is controlled by the hypothalamus in the brain. Okay, and the hypothalamus detects whether you are too hot or too cold, and it makes adjustments accordingly to maintain your body temperature. So things that occur would be if you are too hot, you get vasodilation. Now, vasodilation is when the blood vessels dilate, mean they become bigger, so that any blood moving through, any heat can be lost to the surface. So all of the capillaries that are in that skin, okay, all those blood vessels, they enlarge and they get bigger, and all of the heat diffuses out. And that would be why when you're exercising, you get red in the face a lot of the time, because all of the blood vessels are dilating to try and release as much heat as possible. You also have sweating. So you release sweat from the sweat glands, because as that sweat evaporates from the top layer of the skin, okay, it cools you down. So we sweat to get that evaporation process. All the hairs lie flat so that we don't need to trap anything. Okay, and you get as much surface area as possible in terms of releasing as much sweat from as much places, lying down all of those, and vasodilation. Then if it's cold, we have the opposite. So we have vasoconstriction, where the arterioles and all the arteries are getting much smaller, so that we can reduce the amount of blood available towards the skin, so that we keep all that heat in the blood as opposed to getting it released. You also start to shiver, because the shivering and the movement of your muscles can generate heat because of respiration, because you're using up the energy to make those muscles move, and you release heat as a byproduct. The hairs on your skin stand up in order to trap any heat so that we can insulate, so that we won't lose as much heat as possible. Okay, and you try and curl up as small as possible so that you don't have any surface area, and you cover yourself in blankets so that we can keep all the heat that we have. So now if we look at that in terms of our feedback mechanism. So remember, this whole thing happens in a feedback mechanism loop that we call. So we start at normal body temperature, and normal body temperature is 37 degrees on average. So now, if we get too hot, okay, so something has happened and we've increased in body temperature. We have the thermostat, or the mechanism, in the hypothalamus in the brain that would then activate what we call the cooling mechanisms. So now the cooling mechanisms would be that your sweat glands produce more sweat to increase your heat loss by evaporation. Okay, the skin blood vessels would get wider, and that's called vasodilation. To increase heat loss by radiation, the hairs on the skin will lie flat to reduce the insulation and increase heat loss, and there would be no shivering, because we don't need to keep any heat. The body temperature would then decrease, okay, and then all the cooling mechanisms would be switched off by the hypothalamus. And we return back to normal body temperature of 37 degrees. Okay, so then if the opposite happened and now we decreased in body temperature, we got colder. Okay, the thermostat in the hypothalamus in the brain would activate your warming mechanisms. Okay, and by that, the sweat glands would produce less sweat. Okay, to reduce heat loss by evaporation. The skin blood vessels would get narrower, and that is vasoconstriction. To reduce heat loss by radiation, the hairs on the skin would stand up. To trap air, to insulate and decrease heat loss. Then you would have shaking occurring, okay, in the shivering of the muscles, okay, to generate your heat. The body temperature would increase, and the warming mechanisms are switched off by the hypothalamus. And that returns back to the normal body temperature of 37 degrees. So our negative feedback always works in a cycle of getting back to where we want for homeostasis. So that is your negative feedback loop for body temperature, okay, and how the skin helps warm us up. So then the other feedback mechanism that we also need to know about is all about the blood sugar regulation. So you remember learning about blood, and in the blood we have plasma, and in the plasma is where we carry glucose, okay, because we want the glucose to go to all our cells so that we can have respiration occurring. But we need to maintain those glucose levels, because if we don't and we have too much glucose in the blood, it's going to change the concentration, and it's going to cause water to come in where we might not want it to, because remember, water would follow all the ions. Okay, and then the opposite occurs if the blood glucose gets too low, and then we don't have enough glucose for energy. So we always need to maintain the levels in the right way, and that happens with the hormones insulin and glucagon. So I explained in the last video that our hormones insulin and glucagon come from the pancreas, specifically in little cells in the pancreas that we call islets of Langerhans. Okay, and we're going to release insulin or glucagon, which would be from the pancreas, travel in the blood, and it would act on the liver. And it will tell the liver to either be storing glucose or releasing glucose. So glucose is what we need for respiration. But if we don't need it, we want to store it. And we store it by joining it all together and forming glycogen. Now, insulin is the hormone that takes glucose and turns it into glycogen to store it. And then it doesn't have any impact on osmosis. If we are lacking in sugar, we want to take the glycogen and turn it back into glucose. And we do that with the hormone glucagon. So insulin takes glucose to glycogen. Glucagon takes glycogen back to glucose. So if we look at your feedback mechanisms for your blood glucose, when the blood glucose concentration gets too high, which would be after you eat a meal, okay, and you've digested it and you've now absorbed all the glucose, the blood concentration rises. When that happens, the pancreas releases insulin. So insulin is released from the pancreas. Okay, that then travels to the liver, and it stimulates the liver to store it as glycogen. And now once it's stored as glycogen, the blood sugar gets lowered. And then that would stay that way until if we don't eat for a while, then the blood sugar gets too low. So then what we want is we want to release the glucose back. So when our blood sugar gets too low, glucagon is released from the pancreas. And the glucagon stimulates the liver to break down the glycogen. And it turns the glycogen to glucose. And that then causes our blood sugar level to rise. And then we would have our blood sugar moving to where the cells need the energy, because if it dropped because you were exercising, or if your brain needs more glucose for more energy, it would travel to where it needs to go. And then the one thing that comes along with maintaining your blood glucose levels is sometimes it doesn't work properly, and that is when you could get the disease diabetes. So diabetes is a disease where the insulin production is a problem. Could be type 1 diabetes, which means that the pancreas, either the cells can't produce insulin anymore, they may have been attacked by your immune system, or something has occurred where the cells in the pancreas can't make insulin. And then that person that has diabetes would need to take insulin every time they eat a meal in order to maintain those blood sugar concentrations. Or type 2 is sometimes when the body becomes too exposed to insulin all the time, the liver cells can become intolerant to it. So if you have a diet that is really, really high in sugar and you are constantly trying to make the insulin, the liver becomes intolerant, and any insulin that gets made is not effective anymore. And that's where you then have to then get synthetic insulin or take medications and things like that to try and get your body to adjust those glucose levels. So either type 1 or type 2, but diabetes has to be maintained, okay, properly, because if you have diabetes and you let it go untreated, you get symptoms such as constantly feeling thirsty, frequent urination, and weight loss, because now your cells cannot get any sugar, so they start to break down fat and muscle tissue and things like that. So it can be quite a dangerous disease if it goes untreated. Okay, but that is all we need to know about homeostasis and maintaining our constant internal environment.